And it is my pleasure now to introduce Hussein Amery, who you just heard a few words from on cooperation between Israel and the Arab states. Hussein is a professor of international studies at the Colorado School of Mines and currently serving as the director of the Division of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. So he's a well-known expert in issues in the Arab states with regard to water, and he is going to discuss today threats to water security for the Arab Gulf states, and I'm sure we'll hear some connections to the discussion that we just had.
Thank you, Aaron. Okay. Good morning. Thank you all for being here. I want to thank the organizers for putting together this conference. I know that organizing a conference like this or a symposium like this takes a lot of effort, a lot of work, and a lot of people have been involved in intensive communication with all of the speakers, and so thank you all for your hard work. And I want to especially applaud the effort, the cross-cutting effort across campus to have social science, humanities, philosophers, social scientists, and geographers like myself sort of be in the same room with physical scientists and natural scientists and engineers, so that we can have a more complete and comprehensive view of water issues in the Middle East. My talk will focus on the Middle East part, if you like, or the Arabian Peninsula, an area that is in fact significantly drier than the Jordan River Basin, where Israel and Jordan and other countries are located. So I'm going to give you a broad survey of the types of threats to water security in the Arab Gulf states. So that is the focus of my talk, and my main argument is to mitigate security threats. Gulf states can mitigate security threats by improving social and environmental resilience in their midst. So given the fact that resilience, sustainability and resilience are the focus themes of this particular symposium, I will try to highlight the importance of resiliency in my comments. Much of my talk is drawn from my book that was published a couple of years ago on Arab water security, threats and opportunities in the Arab Gulf states. In the early to mid-1980s, there was an expanded conceptualization of security. Up until that point, states viewed threats to national security as being threats that emanates from another states. And since then, the issue of national security became much broader, and it included, since the 1980s, threats such as degraded quality of life, such as environmental degradation, such as water scarcity. Up until that point, such issues were not seen as necessarily affecting or threatening water security or national security. Much more recently, the National Intelligence Council issued a report that argued, looking forward, the overarching megatrends that will shape the world in the future can be narrowed into the following 4 points: individual empowerment, the diffusion of power, demographic patterns, and the growing nexus among food, water, and energy in combination with climate change. Certainly the last point is an issue that a lot of the speakers would be commenting on in one way or another. And I'll be coming back to these themes in a few minutes. Given the nature of my talk, I think it's important to sort of define water security. Water security, the shortest, briefest definition of water security is tolerable water-related risk to society. There are a lot of different definitions of water security. They all revolve around this theme. And you would notice that I highlighted tolerable because different regions, different communities in different parts of the world have a different level of tolerance for water supply interruption, for example. Even different professions have different tolerance for different levels of water supply interruption or for different qualities of water. And risk, of course, varies from place to place. So the region I'm going to be talking about is the Arab Gulf states. The Arab Gulf states are organized through the Gulf Cooperation Council. It's made up of 6 countries, and you have the names on the screen. I'm going to mostly focus on the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, the 2 largest, most influential members of the GCC Council. And here's an aerial photograph of the Arabian Peninsula. It's arid to hyper-arid environment. The southern stretches of the Arabian Peninsula is referred to as, or is named as, the empty quarter. It's known as the empty quarter because it's a very hostile environment, extremely hot, and not a whole lot of things live there, except for oil, of course. So water stress and water scarcity, if we were to look at water availability in the Middle East, you would see that the Arab Gulf states are in the severe water scarcity zone, the red line there. And you see where the only water-rich countries would be Iraq, Lebanon, and to some extent Turkey, water-rich being a relative term, of course. Now, to give you an understanding of the types of water problems or water challenges that the Arab Gulf states face, these pie charts highlight the types of water usages that the Arab Gulf states engage in, and the solid green part of the pie chart indicate agricultural water use. In other words, you would see from these pie charts that the vast majority of water in the Gulf states goes towards the production of food. So making the desert to bloom, if you like, and food self-sufficiency have been important focus areas of these governments. The World Water Development Report of 2012 had a list of they did a global survey of the top 10 groundwater abstracting countries, and Saudi Arabia, globally speaking, was the number 8 groundwater abstractor. And so Saudi Arabia, since shortly after the 1973 oil embargo, in the very early 1980s, they started a wheat self-sufficiency program in the kingdom that cost them a lot of money and a lot of water that they've recently abandoned. I'll come back to that in a minute. And the vast majority of the water that they use to irrigate their wheat fields come from groundwater supplies, and groundwater supplies in much of the Arabian Peninsula, including Saudi Arabia, these groundwater supplies are non-renewable. Unlike the mountain aquifer, for example, in the Jordan River Basin in Israel and Palestine. The threats to water security. We can organize threats to water security along the following classifications, along the following categories. We can think of man-made threats, natural threats, and technological threats. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I've highlighted some that I'm going to be making some comments on. Man-made threats can include threats from terrorism or human error, if you like. Natural threats, such as cyclones, earthquakes, and what have you. Technological threats, infrastructure fails. Technology fails us sometimes, and conceptually speaking, disaster resilience can be captured in this flow chart. It should include disaster resilience should include social resilience, economic resilience, institutional resilience, infrastructure resilience, community capacity, environmental system resilience. Put them all together, then you would have pretty well-established resilience to disasters. Just to give you an idea about the Saudi version of making the desert bloom, these pictures are over time from the top left picture. They're all of the same region. Okay, the top left is from 1987. The one below it is 1991. Top right is from 2000, and the bottom right is from 2012. You see the massive transformation. And I call it the Saudi version because in the 1970s, I think, and maybe even into the 1980s, Israel had its own version of making the desert bloom as well. And these pictures will give you a flavor of what it means to make the desert bloom. And in the top left corner picture, you would see the sand dunes in the background, right? So they turned the sand dunes into the lush green fields that you see in the foreground, and more or less the same thing in the picture with Saudi wheat. So, like I said, in the early 1980s, the Saudis decided to have wheat self-sufficiency, wheat being a key staple in the Saudi diet. In addition to rice, of course, kapsa for all of those who know the Gulf. And of course, to grow wheat in the desert would be impossible if it weren't subsidized, heavily subsidized by the government. So the government subsidized everything from giving away water for free to subsidizing seeds, fertilizers, and loans. I mean, I think loans were free of interest, interest-free loans. And even they subsidized the prices of agricultural tractors. So wheat production then skyrocketed, and in 2008, the government realized that they're running out of groundwater supplies very, very rapidly. Remember that the aquifers in the Arab Gulf states, most of them are non-renewable, so you use the water and you lose it and lose it kind of thing. And in 2008, they realized that groundwater supplies should be preserved, certainly for emergency reasons, if nothing else. So they began to see water in more strategic terms than they had seen it before, starting in 2008. And they introduced a policy that they stuck with, despite the spike in food prices in 2008. They introduced a policy, the Saudis did, of abandoning, gradually phasing out the subsidy for wheat, and as a result, we see that wheat production plummeted after that. So threat of terrorism is real in any part of the world, including the Middle East. Globalization is a term that is used in the context of globalization, so I've adapted that idea to the notion of security, so I'm calling this globalization of security threats. What I mean by this is security threats can be localized. So I'm quoting Collins from his book. He argues that the process of globalization has led to internal issues becoming externalized, and external issues becoming internalized. And to illustrate the idea here is, think of the fact that Saudi Arabia and Bahrain have significant minorities or majorities of Shia, and the Shia, rightly or wrongly, they feel oppressed in these countries, and that internal issue, the presence of Shia in these countries, have become a rallying cry for the Shia across the Middle East, and certainly by groups like Hezbollah, right? And so this internal issue has become externalized, and that poses a certain threat of sorts to stability in these countries. And in the same token, the Sunnis in Syria and Iraq certainly feel oppressed by the ruling governments. In Iraq, certainly by the Maliki government, the Sunnis felt very, very marginalized and oppressed. And that was one of the reasons for the rise of ISIS. I thought that Obama created ISIS. I stand corrected, I suppose, here. I'm getting political. I should avoid that, right? This is not the time to do it. So the Sunnis felt oppressed, and the Sunnis of the Gulf states, therefore, certainly from Saudi Arabia, some Sunnis from Saudi Arabia, or many Sunnis from Saudi Arabia, have joined the ranks of ISIS. This is an external issue, have become internalized, and of course, some of these fighters go fight in Syria and Iraq and then come back. They come back sort of ideologically loaded and angry and battle-hardened, and they can pose a security threat to the native lands. Infrastructures can be soft targets, despite the fact that it's very, very difficult to sort of get into a desalination plant to visit. Gulf states have hardened over the years the security parameters around desalination plants, but we know from 9/11 and from other terrorist incidents that terrorists can be very creative in their approaches. And at the Ataturk Dam myself, the last reference, the last bullet there, at the Ataturk Dam, one of the largest dams in the world, I was visited there about 12 years ago, and I had a camera in hand. The soldiers, heavily armed soldiers, wouldn't allow me to take pictures. Then I said to them, I'm an academic invited by the ministry that built this dam to speak at a conference down the street. Oh, if that's the case, feel free to take pictures. And then I said, can I take pictures of you soldiers? And I said, of course. Then one of them volunteered and gave me his machine gun to take a picture with his machine gun. All this within the 5-minute conversation, right? And so, I mean, water security is not where it should be, I think. And there's a lot of, we should be concerned about the security of infrastructures, hardened as they may have become. But I would argue, without much effort, I discovered a loop. I mean, just by chatting with a couple of soldiers, he handed me a machine gun, his machine gun. Now I want to turn to the fact that the Gulf states have a large number of many millions of guest workers, and they're not immigrants, they're guest workers because they're there on on a work permit, if you like. When that expires, then they leave. And quite recently, there was an opinion piece in the Wall Street, in the New York Times, that described the conditions that they live in, that these people live in, as being virtual slaves. And the situation in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, at least for the blue-collar workers, not the professional class, for the blue-collar workers, a lot of them that description actually is accurate. The Saudi Assistant Minister of Defense said that terrorists may target water resources and destroy desalination plants or poison rivers, pipelines, wells, and underground water. So the Saudi authorities and other Gulf authorities are quite conscious of the fact that the terrorists have their eyes on the water infrastructure. Keep in mind that desalination process is extremely energy intensive. So to bring down an energy infrastructure, to bring down a refinery or energy supply system, in a country like Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, you're effectively bringing down also desalination plants, or you're certainly seriously impacting desalination plants, because again, the desalination is a very water-intensive process. Other threats include things like speedboats loaded with explosives. One of the things that Americans discovered in southern Iraq shortly after they occupied the country is they had an attack by a couple of guys on very flimsy boats. They approached a oil refinery in southern Iraq, and they blew it up, stopping oil exports from Iraq for a couple of months. And there is a lot of illicit trade between Iran and the Gulf states, illicit trade that happens under the noses of the security apparatus that exists there. In 2010, there was a terrorist motorboat attack on an oil tanker that belonged to the Emirates. And of course, there was a terrorist attack on an American gunboat I think it was docked in the ports of either Oman or Yemen, about the same year. And of course, to make for desalination to become economic, the bigger desalination plant, the cheaper, effectively, the cost is. And so they're building bigger and bigger desalination plants around the world, including in Saudi Arabia. The largest, or one of the largest desalination plants in the world is in Ras Al Khair in Saudi Arabia. It produces something like a million cubic meters of water a day, and this concentration of desalination production in one place can make for a bigger target for potential terrorists. We know from WikiLeaks that the capital city of Saudi Arabia, Riyadh, gets almost all of its desalination water from all of its fresh water from one place, from a Jubail desalination plant on the East Coast. And this is a city of about 5 or 6 million people. By the assessment of the embassy, American embassy in Riyadh, they said that if that plant was to be destroyed or significantly damaged, the current structure of the Saudi government could not exist anymore, right? And so it would affect basically the Saudi government's ability to govern and continue governing. Obviously, a pretty serious security threat. And Richard Perrow have developed the so-called, what he calls the normal accident theory, that technologies essentially fail, right? As well designed as they may be, even highly reliable systems fail because of the interactive and complex nature of these technologies. Okay, on time? Okay. And of course, you have the cybersecurity threat. We've been hearing a lot more about this, and that comes from all kinds of places. Incidentally, Iran was suspected to be behind a cybersecurity attack or infiltration on a small dam in the New York area, I believe. This was in the last 6 or 9 months. Now the dots along the southern coast of the Persian Gulf, these circles, they indicate desalination plants and their sizes, and you see that that coastline is dotted with desalination plants, which reflects the very heavy dependence. It reflects the heavy dependence of the Gulf states on water from desalination plants. And what this slide does not show is the fact right along where the word Iran is on the map, you have one of Iran's major nuclear facilities, right? And that also that coastal area right along right along the shore of Iran is a fault line, and it's an earthquake active zone. So if something were to happen to, if there was ever a radioactive spill into the Gulf states, that could spell deep trouble for the Arab Gulf states' abilities to quench the thirst of their own populations. And also from WikiLeaks, we know that the Saudi officials engaged Russians to pass a message on to Iran to see if they can move that nuclear facility away from the coast. And it didn't work. Climate change, a quick comment on climate change. Cyclones in the Indian Ocean are very well known. There's nothing new there. But the issue, what is new though, is that the Indian Ocean is experiencing more cyclones, and more cyclones are touching land in the Arabian Peninsula than ever before. More cyclones are touching land more than ever before. In 2007, there was a major cyclone that touched land and destroyed some of the infrastructure in Oman, including significant damage to desalination plants. This Gates is not the Bill Gates of Microsoft, but this Gates is the former defense secretary. Bob Gates argued that one should confront terrorism by dealing with its root causes, including respect of human rights and freedoms. And I'm thinking here as a mitigation measure that the way the expat workers are treated in the Gulf states is unsustainable and can potentially cause a security threat. And so doing something, that's one area that the Gulf states can act on and should act on to mitigate security threats. In fact, Obama, in an interview the year before he left office, he explicitly talked about the internal security threats. That's how he phrased it, some language like that, about internal security threats should be a bigger concern for the Gulf states than Iran. And diversifying supplies, sources of supply is another mitigating, another way to mitigate threats. So avoiding evaporative losses, so drip irrigation. There's still, incidentally, some flood irrigation that happens in the Gulf states, despite the amazing, environmental systems that exist there, the incredible heat. There's still some flood irrigation. And better use of water capturing from flash floods and treated wastewater. There's a lot more attention that's being paid in recent years to reusing treated wastewater in the Gulf states, and that's a good thing, obviously. Recharging over-pumped aquifers, especially in the wintertime, because obviously water demand in the summer is much higher than in the winter, and the desalination plant can produce at a certain level to satisfy needs in the summer and in the winter. And obviously, since you need less in the winter, some of that water can and should be used to recharge aquifers. And there's a lot more attention that's being paid to building and developing storage capacity, water storage. I got ahead of myself, so there's much greater effort to reusing treated wastewater. So by way of conclusions, water security is enhanced by mitigating potential triggers of violence, such as dealing with local social grievances, diversifying and decentralizing freshwater sources, which would include storage tanks, building more storage tanks, and the conservation through water demand management, and to unsubsidize water use would be one big step in that direction. That's actually much harder. To unsubsidize water use is much harder said than done. Thank you for listening, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Hussein, for the quite informative talk, so that we can see there's common challenges in many places throughout the Middle East. So again, we'll open this up for questions on this material or the broader issues of water resilience and security. Eli.
Thank you, Hussein. I want to refer to one element of your presentation that dealt with the terrorist threat. Now, in many ways, this, whatever you have enumerated, the elements are universal. They refer to the Gulf area, but they could easily be applicable to other regions in the Middle East, including Israel. My question to you, has there been any centralized effort by the Gulf cooperation states to address this issue? And if at all, and if so, what has been done, what can be done, what should be done. Can this be addressed? Because this is a nightmare. And I'm sure that it is a nightmare for the Gulf states, just as it is for Iraq, Syria, and other parts of the Middle East.
The issue of terrorism in particular, the threat of terrorism in particular, that's what you're asking about? I don't think enough is being done. I don't think there's echo all of a sudden. Maybe I should just stand back here. I'm going to go into a delicate territory here. Our good president was just in Saudi Arabia a few days ago, and the ideology of the religious ideology in the Gulf states, especially in Saudi Arabia, is rather rather rigid, rather radical, and it has the ultra-conservative interpretation of Islam that we hear from the Saudis makes it easier for young recruits to leave the country and join organizations like ISIS. And some efforts are being made in trying to crack down on ultra-radical imams, but I think a lot more should be done in that area. Reaching out to the expatriates and treating them more humanely is an area that not nearly enough is being done in. So, for example, as oil prices went south in the last 2.5 years, the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, had kicked out a large number of expatriate workers. And the way they got them to leave the country was sometimes unpleasant, led to, in one or two cases, it led to street battles between the security forces and the immigrants or the guest workers. So there's a lot of frustration amongst the blue-collar workers in the Gulf, and that issue, not a whole lot is being done there, in my opinion, to treat them more humanely by giving them more rights and things like that.
So, other questions for Hussein? Oh, Alex. Alex is one of the students in the course that Ellie and I co-teach.
Hello. Of course, there are water security is a threat throughout the Middle East to varying degrees of severity and imminency, but to me it seems clear that the most severe and most imminent threat is in Yemen, where you have 20 million people in a country with very little water, a government with very little capacity to provide them with fresh water, and an ongoing war which is preventing the ability of the government to address those problems. And I was wondering what your take is on that imminent crisis and its implications for the broader Gulf and the broader region once it worsens to the point where there could potentially be, say, a refugee crisis or massive loss of human life.
An excellent question. Yemen is an area, water scarcity in Yemen is an area that deserves a lot more attention than it actually gets. The mass migration from Yemen started, in fact, before the war of 2015, and the mass migration in Yemen has a lot to do, in my opinion, with the extreme water scarcity and was in Yemen. So essentially, a lot of these migrants can be thought of as water refugees or environmental refugees. And we must also, when we speak of water scarcity, in my opinion, we must think about the fact that some of the water scarcity, if not a lot of the water scarcity, has to do with poor water governance, poor water management. And I mean, to make the desert bloom, that in itself is a pretty blatant example of misuse of water resources. So your point is, well, I'm not sure if I answered your question.
What do you see as the implications of a broader water refugee crisis as people, as the remaining water that is available in, say, groundwater aquifers starts running dry, and say Sanaa is projected to run out of water very soon? And how do you think the region can handle large movements of people as a result of water scarcity?
I mean, that is, I tell you that our federal government have been thinking about this for some time, and here in Washington, they're concerned about mass movement. I mean, I don't know that there's any other really answer to that. There's desalination, as brilliant of a technology as it is, it continues to be more expensive. It continues to be too expensive for a country like Yemen. Desalination is, at least so far, has been a technology for the richer countries like the Gulf states, like Israel, like California. No, California is not a country, maybe they'd like to be, but so mass migration, and mass migration would have political implications. Political implications meaning instability, potential instability from mass migration.
Okay, we have. Oh, thank you. Go ahead.
I'd just like to ask a question about conservation through water demand management, and you specifically address outsourced water-intensive farming. What part of that equation is linked to water-intensive livestock management? Have you just looked at farming or, herding?
Is one of the largest. Amery is a meat and dairy company in Saudi Arabia. It's one of the largest in the world, and they imported cattle from Denmark, I believe, in Western Europe, and from northeastern parts of the USA. And I don't know that I can separate the food production versus livestock production. I don't know that I can separate those, but there is no effort to outsource livestock from the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but the Saudis have recently, in the last year or two, they've recently lifted all subsidy from growing fodder for meat, for cattle, right? So Amery is importing almost all of their cattle feed from abroad, including some parts of the USA.
Great. So thank you again, Hussein. So let's thank Hussein again.
Thank you.